$17, a stack of unpaid debts, and the Iowa winter arriving 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Delavos was 31 years old, owned 40 acres that weren't entirely hers, and had no living man who could call her wife. The widower carries the protection of grief. The widow carries suspicion. She entered October with enough firewood for 3 weeks, flour for 2, and the certainty that the kindness of strangers always came with a price. The market was 8 miles away. The general store belonged to Vernon Hoffman, a married man, respectable, who knew exactly what a woman alone needed and what she might be willing to pay. Hunger doesn't negotiate, cold doesn't forgive, and dignity is the luxury that freezes first. She had until March to prove she could survive without selling herself. Nature doesn't accept excuses, and the men who control credit, they know that better than anyone. And before we step into what came next, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city below. I want to know how far this story is traveling. The land had been Thomas's idea. Delavos hadn't wanted to leave Illinois. She hadn't wanted the 40 acres in Cerro Gordo County, hadn't wanted the sod-turned fields that someone else had broken and abandoned, hadn't wanted the cabin with gaps in the chinking wide enough to see daylight through. But Thomas had wanted it. Thomas had seen opportunity where she saw only distance and cold. He'd filed the claim in April of 1878, paid the fees, signed the papers, told her they'd have their own place, finally, after years of renting rooms above his brother's store in Galena. Told her the soil was good, told her Iowa was the future. By November, he was dead. It happened at the Mason City lumber mill, where he'd taken work to pay for seed and tools. A chain snapped. The log rolled. 3 men saw it happen, and none of them could say exactly how. Just that Thomas Voss had been standing in the wrong place when iron failed and gravity won. They brought him back in a wagon. Della buried him on the south edge of the property, under a cottonwood that hadn't yet lost its leaves. She paid the minister $4 she didn't have. The neighbors she barely knew stood in silence for 11 minutes, then left her alone with a clay-heavy grave and a winter coming fast. That was 8 months ago. She'd spent the spring and summer trying to hold the claim, planted late, harvested less, sold what she could to cover what Thomas owed. The land office didn't care that she was alone. The claim was filed. The taxes were due. The mortgage holder in Cedar Falls sent letters on the 1st of every month, reminding her that widowhood wasn't an exemption from debt. By September, she'd sold the plow, 2 chairs, and Thomas's good coat. By early October, she had $17 left, and a list of creditors who'd stopped being polite. The cold came early that year. She woke on the morning of October 10th to frost thick as gauze across the inside of the window glass. The air in the cabin tasted like metal. Her breath hung visible even beneath 2 quilts. Outside, the sky had that bone-white color that meant snow wasn't a question anymore, just a matter of days. Della sat up slowly, pulled a shawl tight across her shoulders, and walked barefoot to the stove. The firewood box held 9 pieces, maybe 10 if she split one down the center. She'd been rationing since mid-September, burning only enough to cook and take the edge off the night cold. It wasn't enough anymore. She lit a small fire, boiled water for cornmeal mush, ate standing near the heat. The cabin was 1 room, 16 by 18 feet, with a loft Thomas had never finished. The floor was packed earth. The roof was sawed over rough-cut lumber. It leaked in 2 places when it rained. When it snowed, she didn't know yet. There was a trunk against the north wall that held her clothes and Thomas's remaining shirt. A table, 1 chair now, A rope bed with a corn husk mattress, a shelf with 4 books, a tin cup, 2 plates, a skillet, and a jar of lard that was nearly empty. On the wall above the stove hung a mirror with a crack through the center and a framed daguerreotype of her mother, dead now 6 years, who'd told Della once that marriage was safety and anything else was risk. Della looked at her own reflection in the broken mirror. Thin face, dark hair pulled back hard, eyes that had stopped looking soft sometime after the funeral. She was 31 but felt older, the kind of older that came from understanding exactly how little mercy the world held for women without men. She pulled on Thomas's boots, too big, but hers had split at the sole, and stepped outside. The wind hit her immediately. It came straight out of the north, flat and constant, carrying the smell of snow that hadn't fallen yet. The sky was low and white. The land around her stretched flat in every direction, broken only by the thin line of trees along the creek a 1/4 mile east. No smoke rose from any neighboring chimney. The closest house belonged to a family named Peterson, 3 miles south. She'd spoken to them twice, once at the funeral, once when she'd borrowed a saw. Della walked to the woodpile. It was smaller than she'd let herself admit. 2 weeks if she burned carefully. 3 if she froze at night. She'd need to buy more, or cut it herself, and she had neither money for one, nor strength left for the other. Thomas had always handled the wood. Della had handled the house, the garden, the meals. That division had worked when there were 2 of them. Now it just meant there were things she didn't know how to do, and no time to learn gently. She counted the logs again as if the number might change. It didn't. Inside, she sat at the table and opened the wooden box where she kept the money, $17 in coins and 2 crumpled bills. She spread it out, counted it twice. It was still $17. The list of what she owed sat beside it, written in her own hand on the back of a seed catalog, mortgage payment. November, the yacht 50, store credit. Hoffman & Sons, 420 seed debt. Spring, 3 ozers. Minister, funeral, 4 ozers property tax. Overdue, $675, $26.45 total. She had 17. Della folded the paper slowly, set it aside, and stared at the coins as if they might multiply under her gaze. They didn't. Money didn't work that way. It disappeared when you needed it, and reappeared in the hands of men who smiled when they told you no. The wind outside picked up. She heard it test the edges of the roof, rattle the door in its frame. Somewhere, a shutter banged loose. She didn't go fix it. There wasn't enough light left in the day, and it didn't matter anyway. The cold would come in whether the shutter held or not. By mid-afternoon, the snow started. It came soft at first, small flakes that swirled and vanished before touching ground, then heavier, then constant. Della stood at the window and watched the land turn white. The horizon disappeared, the trees blurred. The world shrank down to the 4 walls around her, and the wood running out in the box beside the stove. She thought about Thomas, about the way he used to stand at this same window in the evenings, arms crossed, talking about the crops they'd plant, the barn they'd build, the future that would justify the present. She'd believed him because it was easier than not believing, and because he'd been so sure. Now he was gone, and she was still here, and the future he'd promised had turned into a winter she might not survive. She lit the lamp as the sky dimmed, ate the rest of the cornmeal cold, wrapped herself in both quilts, and sat near the stove, feeding it 1 piece of wood every hour, trying to make the heat last. The snow fell all night. By morning there were 4 inches on the ground, and the temperature had dropped so low the water in the basin had frozen solid. Della cracked the ice with the handle of a spoon, melted it over the fire, drank it lukewarm. She had flour enough for another week if she stretched it. Lard for less. No meat, no eggs. The chickens had died in August from something she didn't understand and couldn't fix. The garden had given her potatoes and squash, but she'd already eaten through most of it, or traded it for things she needed more. She put on every piece of clothing she owned. 2 dresses layered, Thomas's shirt, the shawl, a coat that had been her father's, and walked outside into the cold. The snow was still falling, light, dry, the kind that blew instead of stuck. It gathered in the corners of the cabin, piled against the woodpile, covered the grave under the cottonwood until you couldn't tell where the ground ended, and Thomas began. Della stood in the silence. No birds, no wind now. Just snow falling in a world that had gone perfectly, unbearably still. She thought about walking to the Petersons, thought about asking for help, then thought about the way Greta Peterson had looked at her at the funeral. Not unkind, but cautious, the way you looked at something you didn't quite trust. A woman alone was a problem in a place like this, a burden, a question that had no good answer. She turned and went back inside. The fire had nearly died. She added another piece of wood, watched it catch. Did the math in her head again, even though she already knew the answer. The mortgage payment was due in 3 weeks. If she paid it, she'd have $8.50 left. If she didn't, she'd lose the land. If she lost the land, she'd have nothing, not even the illusion of independence. She sat at the table and stared at the numbers until they stopped meaning anything. Outside, the cottonwood swayed in wind she couldn't hear through the walls. The snow piled higher. The sky stayed white. And somewhere far away in Cedar Falls, a man she'd never met was writing her name in a ledger beside a date that was coming whether she was ready or not. Della closed her eyes. She had until March, and she had no idea how she was going to make it to November. November arrived cold and gray and relentless. Della woke each morning to the same routine: crack the ice in the water basin, light a fire with wood she couldn't spare, boil enough water for cornmeal mush, eat it standing because sitting made the cold settle deeper. Then she'd wrap herself in every layer she owned and step outside to check what had changed overnight. Usually nothing had changed, just more cold, more silence, more white sky pressing down like a lid on a world that had forgotten how to move. The firewood went faster than she'd calculated. She burned 3 pieces a day at first, then 4, then 5, when the temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the nails inside the cabin walls. She told herself she was being careful, told herself she was stretching it as far as it would go. But mathematics didn't care about intention. The pile shrank. The cold didn't. By the 2nd week of November, she had enough wood for 6 days, maybe 7 if she let the fire die completely at night, and woke shivering so hard her teeth cracked together. She tried that once. Woke at dawn unable to feel her fingers. Spent 20 minutes blowing on them, rubbing them, holding them near her body until the pain of thawing made her gasp. After that, she kept the fire going, small, barely enough, but going. The food situation was worse. She'd started November with a 10-pound sack of flour, 2 pounds of cornmeal, a jar of lard, and a basket of potatoes she kept in the coldest corner of the cabin to keep them from rotting. No salt left, no sugar, no coffee, no meat, except for the memory of it. She ate twice a day, sometimes once, potatoes mostly, boiled plain or mashed with a scraping of lard when she could justify it, cornmeal mush in the mornings, flour she saved because it could be stretched further, turned into flatbread or gravy or something that felt like a meal even when it wasn't. She stopped thinking about taste, stopped thinking about satisfaction. Food became fuel, something you put in your body so it kept moving. That was all. Her dresses hung looser. Her face looked sharper in the cracked mirror. She noticed it one morning while pulling her hair back, and then stopped looking at mirrors altogether. The silence was the hardest part. Thomas had been quiet by nature, but he'd filled space in ways Della hadn't understood until he was gone. The sound of him moving through the cabin, the scrape of his boots, the way he cleared his throat before speaking, the low hum he made sometimes while working, not quite a song, just sound for the sake of sound. Now there was nothing, just wind, the creak of the roof beams, the occasional snap of wood in the stove, and her own breathing, which seemed too loud in a room that had forgotten what voices sounded like. She tried talking to herself once, said good morning out loud, just to hear words in the air. It sounded so strange and small that she stopped immediately and didn't try again. On November 14th, she walked to the creek. The sky was white. The ground was frozen. The trees along the water were bare and black against the snow. Della stood at the edge, looking at the timber Thomas had always said they'd harvest. Oak, ash, some cottonwood, enough to keep them warm for years if they worked it right. She had an axe, dull now but functional. She had Thomas's saw, the one she'd borrowed from the Petersons and never returned. She had 2 hands and a body that was still strong enough to swing a blade, even if it wasn't strong enough to do it all day. She picked a dead oak, not large, maybe 8 inches across, already down, half buried in snow and leaf litter. She cleared the snow, positioned the saw, started cutting. The blade bit, stuck. She pulled it free, repositioned, tried again. The wood was frozen, hard as stone. The saw skipped and slipped and refused to find a rhythm. Della kept going. Her hands started to ache, then burn, then go numb. She switched to the axe, swung it overhead and brought it down hard. The blade sank in half an inch. She pulled it free, swung again. The impacts jolted up her arms into her shoulders. Sweat soaked through her layers despite the cold. After 20 minutes, she'd cut maybe a foot into the log. After an hour, she'd made it halfway through. She stopped, stood there breathing hard, her chest heaving, her hands shaking, looked at the log, looked at the forest, did the math. 1 log, 2 hours of work, maybe 3 pieces of firewood if she split it right. 3 pieces lasted 1 day. There were 120 days until March. Della let the axe drop. She stood there in the snow, in the cold, in the silence that had no answer for her, and felt the shape of the problem settle over her like a hand, pressing down on her chest. She couldn't do this alone. Not this way. Not fast enough. Not without breaking something inside herself that wouldn't heal before spring. She picked up the axe, walked back to the cabin, stacked the tools against the wall, and sat down at the table. Her hands were blistered, her shoulders ached, and she had 3 fewer pieces of firewood than when she'd started, because she'd burned the fire high while she was gone to keep the cabin from freezing. The numbers didn't lie. She needed help, or she needed money, or she needed to make a choice she'd been avoiding since October. On November 18th, the sky cleared for the first time in a week. Della stood outside and looked at the horizon. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. The snow on the ground had crusted over, hard and bright under a sun that gave light but no warmth. In the distance she could see smoke rising from the Peterson place, thin, gray, the mark of people who had enough wood to burn and enough food to cook. She thought about walking there, thought about knocking on Greta Peterson's door and asking for work, for charity, for anything. But she'd been a stranger to them when Thomas was alive, and widows without family were a different kind of stranger, the kind people helped once, maybe twice, and then stopped noticing. She went back inside. That night she counted the money again. $17. She hadn't spent any of it yet. Hadn't dared, because once she started spending it would go fast, and there'd be nothing left to stop the collapse. She laid the coins on the table, tried to divide them into categories: mortgage, food, firewood. Each category took more than she had. The mathematics was clean and merciless. She couldn't pay the mortgage and eat. Couldn't eat and stay warm. Couldn't stay warm and keep the land. Something had to give. Della sat there until the lamp burned low, until the fire shrank to embers, until the cold crept back in and reminded her that waiting wasn't the same as deciding. By late November, the flour was half gone. She'd been rationing it carefully, mixing it with water to make a thin paste. She cooked on the stove and ate without tasting. It filled her stomach. That was enough, or it had to be. The potatoes were lasting longer, but some had started to soften, to sprout pale fingers reaching toward light that didn't exist in the corner where she kept them. She cut away the bad parts and ate the rest. Waste wasn't an option. The lard was nearly gone. She used it only for cooking now, no longer for the lamp. The cabin stayed darker. She went to bed earlier, woke later, slept more because sleep didn't require firewood or food or decisions. On November 27th, she stood at the window and watched the sky darken. More snow was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the weight of the clouds, in the way the wind had shifted overnight to blow straight out of the north. She had 4 pieces of firewood left. She had $8 in flour and potatoes if she was lucky. She had $17 that wouldn't cover a quarter of what she owed. And she had a choice. She'd been pretending wasn't a choice. Della turned away from the window, sat down at the table, pulled the paper close and looked at the list of debts one more time. The mortgage was due in 3 days. The store in Mason City was 8 miles away, and Vernon Hoffman had made it very clear that his door was open. She folded the paper slowly, put it back in the box with the money, closed the lid. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Della watched them through the window, watched them gather and swirl and cover the ground she'd walked across for 8 months, believing she could hold this place alone. The cold didn't care what she believed, and neither did the calendar. She had 3 days to decide, and she already knew what the choice was going to cost. December 1st arrived on a Tuesday. Della woke to silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. No wind, no creak of timber, just cold pressing in from every direction, and the certain knowledge that the mortgage payment was now 2 days overdue. She lay under the quilts for a long time, staring at the frost patterns on the ceiling beams, doing math she'd already done 100 times. The answer never changed. She didn't have enough. Not for the mortgage, not for food, not for firewood, not for any single thing that would get her through winter intact. The fire in the stove had died overnight. She could see her breath in the dim morning light. She sat up slowly, joints stiff from cold, and began the morning routine. But this time she dressed carefully, not in layers meant for work, but in the best dress she still owned, dark wool, mended at the sleeves but clean. She pulled her hair back tight, washed her face with snow she melted in a pan, looked at herself in the cracked mirror, and saw a woman who was about to ask for something she couldn't afford to be denied. The walk to Mason City took 3 hours. She left at first light with the $17 folded into a cloth inside her coat pocket. The road was frozen hard, rutted with wagon tracks that had turned to stone under weeks of cold. Snow lay thin across the fields on both sides, wind-scraped and crusted. The sky was pale blue, cloudless, beautiful in a way that made the cold worse because beauty implied kindness, and there was none here. She passed 2 farms on the way, saw smoke from chimneys, heard a dog bark once in the distance, but no people, no one working outside, just closed doors and shuttered windows, and the sense of life happening somewhere she couldn't reach. Her feet ached by the time Mason City appeared on the horizon. Small, compact, a handful of buildings clustered along 2 streets like refugees from the emptiness surrounding them. She could see the church steeple, the false front of the hotel, and on the corner of Main and Oak, the painted sign that read, Hoffman and Sons General Store. Della stopped at the edge of town. Her hands were numb inside her gloves. Her face felt tight from wind and cold. She stood there, breathing slowly, gathering herself, preparing for what came next. She'd been in Hoffman's store 5 times since Thomas died, twice to buy supplies, once to pay down the store credit Thomas had opened, once to sell his coat, once to ask if they needed help with inventory or cleaning, or anything a woman could do that might be paid in goods instead of coin. Vernon Hoffman had been polite every time. Professional. He'd given her fair prices when she sold, extended reasonable terms when she bought. And on that last visit, when she'd asked about work, he'd looked at her with something in his expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite interest, but existed somewhere between the two. "Times are hard, Mrs. Voss," he'd said. "Not much call for extra help in winter, but if you find yourself in need, we can talk about arrangements." She'd thanked him, left quickly, told herself she'd find another way. She hadn't found another way. Della crossed the street and pushed open the door to the store. The warmth hit her like a wall. A coal stove burned in the center of the room, radiating heat that felt obscene after weeks of rationing firewood down to embers. The air smelled of coffee and tobacco and leather and lamp oil, the smells of comfort, of surplus, of a world where people didn't count how many sticks of wood they burned in a day. Vernon Hoffman stood behind the counter tallying figures in a ledger. He looked up when she entered. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, well-fed in the way that came from never missing a meal. He wore a pressed shirt and a vest, clothes that spoke of a life insulated from the kind of cold that killed. "Mrs. Voss." He set down his pen. His voice was warm, measured, the tone of a man who understood exactly why she was here. "Wasn't expecting to see you today. Cold morning for a walk." "Mr. Hoffman." Della stayed near the door, unwilling to step fully into the warmth, because it made her aware of how cold she'd been, how cold she still was everywhere the heat hadn't reached yet. "I need to settle my account." He nodded slowly, opened a different ledger, ran his finger down a column of names until he found hers. $4.20, he said. "From September." Della reached into her coat and pulled out the cloth, unfolded it carefully, counted out $4.20 in coins and set them on the counter. Vernon took the money without counting it, made a notation in the ledger, looked at her with an expression that was patient, almost kind. "That's settled, then." He closed the book. Was there something else? This was the moment. The gap she had to cross. The question she had to ask, even though she already knew the answer, would come with conditions. "I need credit," Della said quietly. "For the winter." Vernon didn't react immediately. He just looked at her, steady and calm, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this. "What do you need?" "Firewood, flour, cornmeal, lamp oil." She kept her voice level. "Enough to last until March." He was silent for a moment. Then he came around the counter and walked slowly toward the stove, hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man thinking through a problem that required careful consideration. "That's a substantial amount, Mrs. Voss. Firewood alone through winter. You're looking at $8, maybe $10 if you're burning modest. Add food and supplies, you're close to 20. Della said nothing. She knew the numbers. That was why she was here. Vernon turned to look at her. "You have collateral. The land. The land has a mortgage. I know. Overdue now, I'd imagine." Della's jaw tightened. 2 days. He nodded slowly, not surprised, not judging, just acknowledging a fact they both already understood. "So the land isn't yours to offer." "Not really. I can pay you back in spring, after planting." "With what crop?" His voice was still gentle, still reasonable. "You're one woman on 40 acres. You don't have a plow anymore. Don't have seed money. Don't have help." He paused. "What exactly do you think spring is going to look like?" It was the question Della had been avoiding since October, the one she couldn't answer because the answer required a future she couldn't see from where she stood. She said nothing. Vernon walked back to the counter, leaned against it, folded his arms. His expression was thoughtful, almost sympathetic. "Mrs. Voss, I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand your situation. I know what it's like to be alone in this country. My own wife, God rest her, she passed 6 years ago. I raised my boys without her. It was hard. Still is some days." He paused. "Let that sit between them. Point is, I know what it means to need help, and I'm willing to offer it." Della felt her chest tighten. "What are the terms?" Vernon smiled faintly. "No interest if you clear the account by June. Just principal. That's fair, I think. And if I can't clear it by June." His smile didn't waver. "Then we'd work something out, between reasonable people." There it was, the gap in the offer, the place where generosity ended and leverage began. Della kept her eyes on him. "What kind of something?" Vernon tilted his head slightly, as if surprised she'd ask directly. Then he shrugged, casual, comfortable. "Companionship, maybe. A widow and a widower sharing a meal now and then. Conversation. Company on a cold evening." His voice stayed even. Nothing untoward, just mutual benefit. The words were carefully chosen, polite, deniable, but Della had been a woman long enough to know what lived underneath polite words when men spoke them to women who needed things. "I see," she said quietly. Vernon straightened. "I'm not proposing anything improper, Mrs. Voss. I'm simply saying that credit comes with terms, and terms can be flexible when there's trust between parties." Trust, that was what he called it. Della looked at him standing there in his clean vest and pressed shirt, in his warm store that smelled of surplus, and she understood with perfect clarity what he was offering and what it would cost. It wasn't just money. It was her autonomy, her privacy, her right to say no to things that had nothing to do with debt and everything to do with power. He was offering to let her survive, and in exchange, she'd owe him more than dollars. She'd owe him access, gratitude, the kind of obligation that didn't end when the account was settled, because men like Vernon Hoffman never truly settled accounts with women who needed them. She thought about the cabin, about the 4 pieces of firewood left, about the flour running out, about the cold that didn't negotiate, and the mortgage holder in Cedar Falls who didn't care if she froze as long as the land reverted back to men who knew what to do with it. She thought about Thomas's grave under the snow. She thought about her mother's voice. Marriage is safety. And she thought about what safety actually meant when it came with conditions you couldn't see until you'd already agreed. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hoffman," Della said slowly, "but I'll manage on my own." His expression didn't change. "Will you?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, not offended, just patient. The way you looked at someone who was about to learn something the hard way. "The offer stands, Mrs. Voss, when you're ready to be practical about your situation." Della felt heat rise in her face. Not embarrassment. Anger. The kind she couldn't afford to show but couldn't quite suppress. "Thank you for your time." She turned toward the door. "Mrs. Voss." She stopped, didn't turn around. "Winter's barely started," Vernon said softly, "and you're already out of options." Della pushed the door open and stepped into the cold. The walk back was longer than the walk there. Not in distance, in weight, in the feeling that she'd just closed a door she might need to open again, and the cost of opening it would be higher the second time. She had $12.80 left. She had no firewood except what she could cut herself. She had no credit anywhere in Mason City because Vernon Hoffman owned the only store, and he'd made his position clear. The sky had clouded over by the time she reached the cabin. Snow was coming again. She could feel it in the air, the pressure dropping, the cold deepening into something that would settle in and stay. Inside the cabin was dark. She lit the stove with one of the last 4 pieces of wood, sat at the table, stared at the coins she'd spread out again, even though counting them wouldn't change what they could buy. She thought about Vernon's words, about being practical, about winter barely starting, about being out of options. He was right about one thing. She was out of options that didn't hurt, but some kinds of hurt were clean, and some kinds stained you from the inside in ways that didn't wash out. Della closed her eyes. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere in the dark, the first snow began to fall. By the time February arrived, Della had learned what hunger actually felt like. Not the kind that came from skipping a meal or eating light. The other kind. The kind that hollowed you out from the inside, that made your body feel like it was consuming itself, that turned every thought into a calculation of energy spent versus energy stored. She woke each morning lighter. Not in spirit, in weight. Her dresses hung loose at the waist. Her wrists looked thin and breakable. When she caught her reflection in the cracked mirror, she saw a face that had turned sharp and angular, eyes too large, skin stretched tight over bones that hadn't been visible before. The firewood had run out in mid-January. She'd burned the last piece on January 14th, a Tuesday, and then began burning everything else that would catch fire. The second chair, the wooden crate Thomas had used for tools, scraps of lumber from the unfinished loft, the handle of a broken rake, a board she pried from the inside of the cabin wall, knowing it would let more cold in, but needing the heat now more than she needed insulation later. She burned pages from one of the books, then another, then stopped, because even in desperation there was a line she couldn't cross, and destroying words felt like destroying the last evidence that civilized life existed. The cold was constant now. Not the sharp cold of early winter, but the deep cold of February, The kind that settled into everything and stayed. The kind that made iron brittle and skin crack and breath freeze in your lungs if you inhaled too quickly. Della stopped going outside, unless absolutely necessary. Stopped washing with water because heating it cost fuel she didn't have. Stopped changing clothes because the layers she wore had become insulation she couldn't afford to remove. She slept in everything she owned, woke shivering, spent the days wrapped in quilts, sitting as still as possible, because movement required energy, and energy required food, and food was the one thing she had almost none of. The flour ran out on January the 22nd. The potatoes lasted until February 3rd. After that, she had nothing. Nothing except $12.80 that she hadn't spent, because spending it meant admitting the situation was as bad as it felt, and once she admitted that she'd have to make decisions, she'd been avoiding since December. On February 7th, she walked to the Pedersen farm, 3 miles through snow that had drifted waist-high in places. The sky was white, the air so cold it burned. She wore Thomas's boots, her father's coat, 2 shawls, and a desperation that made her legs move even when they wanted to stop. The Pedersen place was larger than hers. A proper house, barn, smokehouse, chickens scratching in a protected run, signs of life that felt obscene after weeks of silence and scarcity. Della knocked on the door. Greta Pedersen answered. Mid-30s, pregnant again, her belly large under a clean apron. She looked at Della for a long moment, taking in the thin face, the hollow eyes, the trembling that wasn't entirely from cold. Mrs. Voss. Her voice was cautious but not unkind. You look unwell. I need work, Della said. Her voice came out rough, unused. Anything. I can sew, clean, cook. I'll take payment in food. Greta glanced over her shoulder, then back. My husband isn't here. He's in town. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. Greta hesitated, then stepped aside. Come in. You'll freeze, standing there. The warmth inside was overwhelming. A stove burned hot. Bread baked somewhere. Children's voices came from another room. Della stood just inside the door, afraid to step further, afraid that entering fully into this world of warmth and food and normalcy would break something inside her that was already cracking. Sit, Greta said, gesturing toward the table. Della sat. Greta poured coffee from a pot on the stove, set it in front of Della along with a thick slice of bread spread with butter. Real butter. The smell alone made Della's stomach clench so hard it hurt. Eat, Greta said quietly. Della picked up the bread, bit into it. The taste hit her like a blow. She chewed slowly, swallowed, took another bite, forced herself not to cry because crying would waste energy, and she had none to waste. Greta sat down across from her, watched her eat, didn't say anything until Della had finished the bread and half the coffee. How long since you've eaten properly? A while. You're alone out there. It wasn't a question. Yes. Greta nodded slowly. That's hard country for a woman alone. Harder in winter. Della set down the cup, looked at Greta directly. I need work. I'll do anything you need. Laundry, mending, scrubbing floors. I just need food. Greta was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, walked to the shelf and returned with a bundle wrapped in cloth. She set it on the table. Shirt, she said. Needs mending. Collar and cuffs. Patch on the elbow. You do it well. I'll pay you in eggs and potatoes. 4 eggs. 10 potatoes. Fair. It wasn't fair. It was charity disguised as trade. But Della was in no position to refuse charity when it came with the dignity of work attached. Fair, she said. Greta pushed the bundle toward her. "Bring it back when it's done. I'll have more if the work is good." Della took the bundle, stood. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. That's hard mending. Collars nearly worn through." Della walked home with the shirt wrapped inside her coat to keep it dry. 4 eggs, 10 potatoes. It would last maybe a week if she was careful. But it was something, a foothold, a way to survive that didn't involve Vernon Hoffman or the impossible mathematics of debt. She spent 2 days on the mending. Her fingers were stiff from cold and lack of use. The stitches came slow and uneven at first. She unpicked them, started again, worked by daylight because she had no oil left for the lamp, stopped when the light failed, slept, woke, started again. When it was finished, the shirt looked nearly new, the collar reinforced, the cuffs tight and even, the patch on the elbow so carefully matched to the original fabric that you had to look close to see it. She walked back to the Petersons on February 10th. Greta examined the work carefully, turned the shirt over, held it up to the light, nodded once. "Good work." She disappeared into the back of the house and returned with a basket. 4 eggs wrapped in cloth, 10 potatoes, and something Della hadn't expected, a small jar of lard. "For the work," Greta said, "and because you look like you need it." Della took the basket, felt the weight of it, the impossible value of fat and protein and carbohydrate measured against weeks of nothing. "I have more," Greta said. "If you want it. Laundry, mostly. Some sewing. Pays the same. I want it. Good. Come back next week." Della walked home with the basket held against her chest, like something sacred. That night she boiled 2 potatoes and ate them with a spoonful of lard melted over top. The fat coated her mouth, rich and heavy and almost painful after so long without. She ate that slowly, saved 1 egg for morning, stored the rest in the coldest corner where they'd keep. It wasn't abundance, but it was survival. And survival, she was learning, didn't require abundance. Just enough, just barely enough to see tomorrow. Over the next 3 weeks, she walked to the Peterson farm 4 more times. Each time she brought back work. Mending, laundry. Once a full day of scrubbing floors while Greta rested late in her pregnancy. The pay was always the same. Eggs, potatoes, sometimes lard or a heel of bread, once a small bag of cornmeal that felt like wealth. It wasn't easy work. Her hands cracked and bled from lye soap and cold water. Her back ached from bending over washboards. Her fingers cramped from stitching in light so dim she had to squint to see the thread. But it was hers. No one owned her for it. No one held it over her. No one made her feel small or desperate, or like something to be purchased. On February 23rd, Della was in Mason City buying salt with money she'd saved from selling Thomas's saw to a farmer passing through. She saw Vernon Hoffman across the street. He saw her, too. He didn't approach, just stood there on the boardwalk outside his store, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression that was patient and knowing and faintly amused. She met his eyes for just a moment. Then she turned and walked away. That night, back in the cabin, she boiled potatoes and ate them by the light of a fire made from scraps she'd gathered along the road. The cabin was still cold. She was still thin. The mortgage was still unpaid, and the land office was still sending letters she couldn't answer. But she'd made it through February, the worst month, the killing month, the month when cold and hunger and isolation pressed down hardest and broke the people who couldn't bend. She hadn't broken, she'd bent. God knows she'd bent so far she thought she'd snap. But she was still here, still upright, still refusing to be bought. Della wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders and stared into the fire. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the silence was clean, and for the first time since October, she let herself believe that March might actually come. Choices had costs, even when they were the right ones. She'd learned that, was still learning it every day in the ache of her hands, and the hollow of her stomach, and the cold that never fully left. But some costs were worth paying, and some kinds of freedom were worth freezing for. March came in cold, but the cold had changed. It was still there, still present in the mornings when frost covered the windows and the water basin froze overnight. But it had lost its teeth. The kind of cold that killed had passed. What remained was just discomfort, just winter wearing itself out before spring arrived to replace it. Della noticed it first in the light. The sun rose earlier now, set later. The days stretched incrementally longer, minute by minute, enough that she could work by natural light until almost supper time, instead of stopping at mid-afternoon when the darkness came down like a curtain. She noticed it in the snow, too. It was melting at the edges, pulling back from the south-facing walls of the cabin, revealing ground that had been buried since November. The drifts along the creek had settled. The road into town had turned to frozen mud instead of solid ice. Winter wasn't over, but it was losing, and Della was still here. She'd survived February on Greta Peterson's laundry and mending work. 4 trips, 4 baskets of eggs and potatoes, and the occasional mercy of lard or cornmeal. It had been just enough, barely, the kind of enough that left no margin for error, but kept her alive and kept her out of Vernon Hoffman's store. By early March, she'd built something fragile that almost resembled stability. On March 2nd, Greta Peterson went into labor. Della was there when it happened. She'd come to return a week's worth of mending and found Greta bent over the table, breathing hard, one hand pressed to her belly. "How long?" Della asked. "Since dawn." Greta's voice was tight. "Husband's gone to fetch the doctor, but the roads are bad. Could be hours." Della set down the mending. "What do you need?" "Water, boiling, and someone who won't panic." Della had never delivered a baby, had never even been present for one. But she'd seen animals born, had helped Thomas once with a difficult calving that required steady hands and a strong stomach. This wasn't so different, just higher stakes. She built up the fire, boiled water, tore clean cloth into strips, helped Greta to the bedroom and stayed with her through the contractions that came faster and harder as the afternoon wore on. The baby came just before sunset. A girl, small but healthy, crying with good strong lungs that filled the room with sound that felt like proof of something Della had almost stopped believing in, that life could start even when everything else felt like it was ending. Greta held her daughter and cried, not from pain, from relief, from the overwhelming fact of survival. The doctor arrived an hour later, checked both mother and child, and declared everything fine. Greta's husband thanked Della awkwardly, unsure what to offer a woman who'd just helped bring his daughter into the world. Greta knew. "You'll stay for supper," she said. It wasn't a question. They fed her roasted chicken and potatoes and bread with butter and coffee that was hot and strong and real. Della ate slowly, aware that this was more food than she'd had in a single sitting since October. Aware, too, that she'd earned it, not through desperation or begging, but through presence, through being there when she was needed and doing what needed doing. When she left that night, Greta walked her to the door. "There's more work if you want it," she said, "and not just mending. Martha Calhoun in town runs a boarding house. She needs laundry done. Pays in cash or trade. I can put in a word. Della looked at her. Why? Because you didn't leave when things got hard. Greta shifted the baby in her arms. That means something out here. People notice. Della walked home in the dark, with those words sitting heavy and strange in her chest. People notice. She'd spent 5 months trying to be invisible, trying not to be a burden or a problem or a question that required answering. And somewhere in that invisibility, she'd thought she was alone. But she wasn't alone. Not entirely. There were people watching, people measuring. Not all of them with judgment. Some with something that looked almost like respect. On March 5th, she walked into Mason City and found the boarding house. It was a 2-story building on the north end of Main Street, painted white with green shutters and a sign that read, Calhoun House, in neat black letters. Della knocked, waited, knocked again. The woman who answered was in her 50s, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile but hadn't forgotten how to assess. Help you? Her voice was clipped, efficient. Mrs. Calhoun, my name is Della Voss. Greta Peterson said you might need help with laundry. Mrs. Calhoun looked her over, top to bottom, taking in the thin frame, the worn dress, the hands that were cracked and reddened from work. You done laundry before? Yes, ma'am. Hard work. I got 12 boarders, sheets, towels, shirts, everything. Needs doing twice a week. Pays 25 cents a load or trade, if you prefer. 25 cents for a full day's work. It wasn't much, but it was money. Real money she could hold and count and use however she needed. I'll take it, Della said. Start tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Don't be late. Della wasn't late. She arrived at 6, with her sleeves already rolled and her hair tied back. Mrs. Calhoun showed her to the wash-house behind the main building. 2 large tubs, a washboard, a mangle for wringing, a line strung between posts for drying. The pile of laundry was enormous. Della worked through it methodically, sorted by color and fabric, heated water over the fire, scrubbed each piece against the washboard until her knuckles bled and her shoulders burned, wrung them through the mangle, hung them to dry in the cold March air. It took 8 hours. When she finished, Mrs. Calhoun inspected the work, held up a shirt to the light, checked for stains, nodded once. You'll do. She handed Della 25 cents. Same time Friday. Della took the coin. It was warm from being in Mrs. Calhoun's pocket. She closed her fist around it and felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, exactly. Just the slow recognition that she'd found a foothold, a way to climb. Over the next 3 weeks, she built a rhythm. Tuesdays and Fridays, she worked at Calhoun House. Wednesdays, she did mending for Greta Peterson. Thursdays, she scavenged firewood along the creek, dragging dead branches back to the cabin and breaking them into pieces small enough to burn. The money accumulated slowly. 50 cents 1 week, 75 the next. She kept it in the wooden box with the original $17 she'd never spent, watching the pile grow coin by coin. She still wasn't eating well, still wore every layer she owned because the cabin stayed cold, still woke some mornings so tired she could barely move. But she was working, and work, she was learning, was the opposite of helplessness. On March 18th, she saw Vernon Hoffman again. She was leaving Calhoun House with her week's pay when he appeared on the boardwalk, not by accident. He'd been waiting. Mrs. Voss. He tipped his hat. I hear you've been keeping busy. Della stopped, didn't answer. Laundry work. His tone was conversational but edged with something else. Hard on the hands, hard on the back. Must be exhausting. It's honest work. Oh, I'm not questioning that. He smiled faintly, just wondering if it's enough. Della met his eyes. Enough for what? To get you through spring, through summer, through next winter. He paused. 25 cents at a time doesn't pay a mortgage, Mrs. Voss. Doesn't settle debts. Doesn't buy security. It buys dignity. Vernon's smile faded slightly. Dignity doesn't keep you warm. Neither does obligation. For a moment they stood there in silence. The street was empty. The wind carried the smell of thawing earth and distant chimney smoke. Somewhere a dog barked. Vernon broke the silence first. My offer still stands, when you're ready to be practical. I won't be. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. We'll see, he said quietly. Winter comes every year, Mrs. Voss, and it's always harder the second time. He walked away. Della stood there watching him go, her hands still aching from the washboard, her back still tight from bending over tubs all morning. She was exhausted, underfed, barely surviving on the margins of other people's charity and her own stubborn refusal to quit. But she was still here, and she hadn't sold herself to stay. That night she sat at the table and counted her money. $32 total. The original 17 she'd saved through winter plus 15 earned through March. It still wasn't enough to pay everything she owed. The mortgage, the property tax, the store credit she'd settled, but the others she hadn't. The numbers still didn't balance. But they were closer than they'd been in October. Closer than they'd been in February, when she'd had nothing and no path forward, except the one Vernon had offered. Della closed the box and set it aside. Outside the window, she could see the cottonwood tree where Thomas was buried. The snow had melted enough that the grave was visible again, just a slight rise in the earth. Nothing marked except memory. She thought about him sometimes, about the dreams he'd had for this place, about the future he'd imagined that had died with him on a November afternoon when chain and log and gravity converged. She thought about her mother, too, about the warning she'd given. Marriage is safety. Maybe it was, for some. But Della was learning a different kind of safety now. The kind that didn't depend on anyone else's goodwill or protection or tolerance. The kind that came from knowing you could survive the worst and still be yourself on the other side. It was harder. God knows it was harder. But it was hers. And that, she was beginning to understand, was worth almost anything. The prairie didn't care who you used to be. It only cared what you could endure. And Della Voss had endured, not gracefully, not easily, but completely. April came quietly, not with drama or announcement, but with small changes that accumulated, until one morning Della woke and realized winter had finally let go. The frost on the windows was gone. The air inside the cabin no longer tasted like metal. When she stepped outside, the ground was soft under her feet, mud instead of frozen earth, and the smell in the air was different. Wet soil, thawing wood, the faint green promise of things that had been waiting underground for months. The snow had retreated to the shadows, to the north side of the cabin where sun never reached, to the deepest drifts along the creek. Everywhere else the land was bare and brown and ready. Della stood in the doorway and looked at the 40 acres that had nearly killed her. It didn't look like much. Fields that needed plowing, fences that needed mending, a cabin that was more gap than wall in places. But it was still here. And so was she. She'd made it to April, Not easily, not without cost, but completely. The mortgage was still unpaid. The land office letters still came, each one more insistent than the last. She owed property tax, owed the minister for Thomas's funeral, owed debts that added up to more than she'd earned through the entire winter. But she had $32 now, and she had work. Tuesdays and Fridays at Calhoun House, Wednesdays with Greta Peterson. Enough to keep moving forward, even if forward was slow and uncertain and required more faith than she'd thought she had left. On April 3rd, she walked to town to buy seed. The road was muddy. Her boots sank with each step, but the sun was warm on her face, and the sky was blue. And somewhere overhead she heard the first birds she'd heard since October. Geese flying north in formation so perfect, they looked like stitching against the clouds. In Mason City, she went to the feed and supply store, not Hoffman's. She bought 2 pounds of seed corn, 1 pound of beans, a small packet of turnip seed, paid with money she'd earned, and walked out without owing anyone anything. Vernon Hoffman was across the street when she left. He saw her. She saw him. Neither approached. They just stood there for a moment, separated by the width of Main Street and the winter that had tried to break her and failed. He nodded once, not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledgement. Della nodded back. Then she turned and walked home. That afternoon she began preparing the garden plot. It was small, maybe 20 by 30 feet. The soil was heavy clay mixed with last year's dead growth. She worked it with a hoe Thomas had left behind, breaking up clods, pulling weeds, turning under the debris until the earth was loose enough to receive seed. Her hands blistered, her back ached. Sweat soaked through her dress despite the cool air. But she kept working because this was hers to do and no one else's, and there was something clean about labor that produced instead of just sustained. By evening she'd finished half the plot. She went inside, ate a potato boiled with a scraping of lard, and sat at the table as the light failed. The cabin was still cold at night, still bare, still marked by everything she'd burned to survive. But it felt different now, less like a trap, more like a place she'd chosen to defend. On April 7th, she planted the corn. Rows spaced 18 inches apart. Seeds dropped 2 to a hole, covered lightly with soil. She worked slowly, methodically, aware that this was an act of faith more than certainty, that these seeds might fail, that the growing season might be too short or too dry or too cold, that all of this could be for nothing. But she planted them anyway, because faith wasn't about certainty. It was about refusing to surrender to the parts of life you couldn't control. The beans went in next, then the turnips. By April 10th, the entire garden plot was sown, and she stood looking at bare earth that held invisible potential beneath its surface. Nothing showed yet, wouldn't for weeks, but it was there, waiting, the same way she'd been waiting all winter for something to change. On April 14th, Greta Peterson came to visit. She arrived in a wagon with her husband driving and the baby wrapped in blankets. It was the first time anyone had come to Della's property since Thomas's funeral. Greta climbed down carefully, still recovering, and walked to where Della stood near the garden. "Heard you planted," she said. "News travels. It does out here." Greta looked at the turned earth. "You'll need help when harvest comes, if it comes. I'll manage. I know you will." Greta paused. "But you don't have to manage alone anymore. People know what you did this winter, how you held on. That means something." Della didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Greta's husband had stayed with the wagon, but now he climbed down and walked over, carrying a small crate. "For you," he said, setting it down. "Chickens, 6 hens. They're laying." Della looked at the crate, at the birds inside, at the gift that was too large to be casual and too practical to be charity. "I can't pay for these." "Didn't ask you to." He tipped his hat. "You helped bring our daughter into the world. This is thanks. And investment. We'll take eggs as trade when you've got surplus." He climbed back into the wagon. Greta touched Della's arm briefly. "You're not alone here. Remember that." They drove away. Della stood holding the crate of chickens and feeling something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not relief exactly, not gratitude, though that was part of it. Something closer to recognition, that she'd built this, not through charm or compromise or selling pieces of herself she couldn't get back, but through showing up, through work, through refusing to quit, even when quitting would have been easier and more reasonable and probably smarter. She'd built a reputation, and a reputation, she was learning, was a kind of currency that didn't devalue. She built a rough coop that afternoon using scrap lumber and chicken wire she traded work for at Calhoun House. Set the hens inside, scattered feed, watched them settle and peck, and begin the business of living as if the winter had never happened. That night, she ate bread and butter from Greta's last payment and one of the first eggs the new hens produced. It tasted like spring, like possibility, like the future Thomas had promised, but in a shape he'd never imagined. On April 21st, the first green shoots appeared in the garden. Corn, thin and fragile, and perfect. Della knelt beside them and touched one gently, feeling the strength in something so small it could barely hold itself upright. But it was there, breaking through soil that had been frozen for months, reaching toward light and warmth and the season that would either sustain it or let it die. She understood that feeling. By late April, the days were warm enough that she no longer needed a fire except for cooking. The cabin aired out. The smell of winter, smoke and damp and desperation, faded and was replaced by the smell of turned earth and growing things. She still worked at Calhoun House, still did mending for Greta, still counted every penny and stretched every meal as far as it would go. But the edge of desperation was gone. What remained was just the work itself, hard but manageable, exhausting but hers. On April 28th, she received a letter from the land office in Cedar Falls. Final notice: pay the outstanding mortgage and property tax within 30 days, or the property would be foreclosed and sold at auction. She read it twice, set it on the table, looked at the wooden box where she kept her money. $32. She needed $46 to clear the debt. She was $14 short. For a long moment she sat there staring at numbers that still didn't balance, at a problem that still had no clean solution, at the reality that surviving winter hadn't solved everything, had only bought her time. But time, she was learning, was its own kind of wealth. She had 30 days. That was 6 more wash days at Calhoun House, 4 more weeks of mending, and she had chickens now that would start producing surplus eggs she could sell or trade. It would be close, impossibly close. But it wasn't impossible, and impossible was the only thing she couldn't afford to accept. Della folded the letter, put it in the box with the money, closed the lid. Outside, the sun was setting. The garden was growing. The chickens were settling into their coop, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the creek running high with snowmelt, the sound of ice letting go and water moving freely again. She walked to the window and looked out at the land that had tried to break her. It was still hard, still unforgiving, still demanded more than seemed fair or reasonable or sustainable. But she was still here, and she'd learned something in the long winter that would stay with her through whatever came next. That dignity wasn't a luxury, it was a choice, and choices had costs, but some costs were worth paying because the alternative was losing yourself in ways that didn't show on the surface, but hollowed you out from the inside. She'd been offered the easy path, the one that would have kept her warm and fed through winter without the bleeding hands and aching back and constant grinding fear. But that path had a price she wasn't willing to pay. So she'd chosen the hard one, the one that required everything she had and more, the one that left her thin and tired and still in debt, but also still herself, still Delavos, still standing, still free. The prairie didn't care who you used to be. It only cared what you could endure. And she had endured. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but completely. Some loneliness was clean. This was that kind. And as she stood there watching the last light fade from the sky, watching the stars begin to appear one by one over the fields she'd planted with her own hands, she understood something she hadn't understood in October. That survival wasn't the same as victory, and victory wasn't the same as comfort. But there was a kind of triumph in simply refusing to be broken, in saying no when yes would have been easier, in choosing difficult freedom over comfortable constraint. The winter had taught her that, and spring, with all its uncertainty and fragile hope, was teaching her the rest. That you could lose almost everything and still have something worth protecting. That work could be prayer, and struggle could be dignity, and isolation could be a kind of peace, if you learned to carry it right. That the hardest things were sometimes the most honest, and that she, thin and tired, and still fighting, and still here, was stronger than she'd ever imagined she'd need to be. Della turned from the window. Tomorrow she'd work. The day after that she'd work again. She'd earn the $14 she needed, or she'd find another way. She'd plant more seeds, gather more eggs, take more laundry, do whatever it took, because that was what survival looked like now. Not a single moment of triumph, but 1,000 small refusals to quit. And she was good at that. She'd had practice. Outside, the stars turned overhead in patterns older than memory. The creek ran, the garden grew, and somewhere beneath the cottonwood tree, Thomas rested in earth that would bloom again when the season turned. Della closed her eyes. She'd made it to April, and April, she was learning, was just another word for beginning. Have you ever chosen the hard path because the easy one would have cost you something you couldn't afford to lose? Have you ever learned that dignity isn't about comfort? It's about refusing to be bought. Share your story in the comments. I want to know what you've survived and what it taught you about who you are when everything else is stripped away.